Welcome to Bites Bread and Barbecue. I'm Ross Cantina. Today we're going to be talking about XFCE. We're going to be doing tours in various desktop environments and also some benchmarking. Let's take a look. What I did was I created virtual machines that had Endeavor OS, Linux Mint, Fedora, Manjaro, and Xubuntu. Each of these environments was running XFCE. I wanted to give a quick little tour of each environment, and then I was going to do some benchmarking to see if, since it's XFCE and it's on all these different versions of Linux, did it perform the same? Which one was better, if there was any difference? So we're going to take a look at that. Let's get started with a little tour of Endeavor OS. Here we have Endeavor OS running in a virtual machine with XFCE over top. Endeavor OS is a form of Linux that is installed over Arch Linux. It is very lightweight. In fact, if we push the bottom bar here button here, we can see that when it installs, this does not even install an Office suite. Now you can install one at your leisure, but it does not come with one out of the box. In general appearance, it has a typical bottom bar here that looks somewhat reminiscent of Windows 10. But you can see if we go through the different applications here, it installs everything you need for the internet, a couple little things for development, and you have some system and settings utilities here. Let's take a little look for what we're actually running on this version of XFCE. So here we can see again, this is Endeavor, 64-bit, running on Arch Linux. It is XFCE version 4.20. It is running a very recent kernel and using the Windows X11 windowing system. You can see that I developed this on a 4-core i7 computer with 8 gigabytes of memory. And you can also note that when I asked it to do the About window, it popped up fairly quickly, which is what we're looking for in a lightweight environment. If we ask it for the terminal, again, that launches very quickly, and if we try to launch a little program here, execution seems fairly swift. Let's take a look at the file manager. That should pop right up. And how about a web browser? What happens when we launch Firefox? Well, not too bad with the speed there. We'll see if we can go to Google. So everything seems to be running fairly quickly in an environment that is fairly familiar with an icon set and images that we are used to. Log out, you hit the little power button down here, and we shut the computer down. Let's go on to our next environment. Next up is Fedora. This is a Fedora spin running XFCE, the default installation out of the box. We notice a couple things that are different from the Endeavor right off the bat. First of all, the bar is at the top here, and they give you a dock at the bottom that gives it a little bit more of a Apple Mac feel to it. You still have some desktop icons that are present here. If we press the button here to look at applications, the menu is very different. It's a very narrow menu, but as we come down, it expands that. And you can see by default that Fedora installs many more applications than Endeavor did, including some Office applications that are here. So if we look at all that, let's see if we can find an About XFCE here. We can see that it's telling us that we are in fact running Fedora with Fedora Linux. They have their own Linux version. They don't use one of the other Linux to run underneath. Like Endeavor used Arch, Fedora has their own brand, and this is their XFCE. They are also using 4.18 version of XFCE. I believe that Endeavor was using 4.2, so they were using a little bit more recent version, possibly because the Endeavor is a rolling release on Arch. We can also see that the kernel version here is 6.12.7, where the Endeavor OS was 6.12.8. Again, same type of machine running here, 4-core with 8 gigs of RAM. So let's close that out, and like we did on the other one, let's try to launch the terminal and see how quickly it pops up. Very quickly. We'll see if we can run a little program here inside of the terminal. Now, NeoFetch, which you typically use, is no longer found in the Fedora repositories. They use one called FastFetch, essentially the same program. It might give you just a slightly different bit of information, but at any rate, as you can see, that executed very quickly within the terminal. And let's see what we have here for a web browser. We have Firefox. You can see how quickly it pops up Firefox here. Now, in truth, this is the first time I've run Firefox on this virtual machine, so it may take a minute to cache it. And we can see not too bad. Let's pull up Google like we did in the other example, and pretty quickly. Now that may be more dependent on my internet connection than this virtual machine. Let's look at our file folder here, and let's open a folder. And here we are at the home, and we can see that we can pop through the different things on the system here fairly quickly, just as we did in the Endeavour OS. Now, they have a series of different icons here at the bottom. What does this icon do? This is the web browser, pulls back up Firefox. Now, it launched much quicker that time after it had been through its initial install. If we're going to go ahead and look about different things on here, we can search the entire computer, which I did not find to be a feature on the Endeavour OS. You could search from the menu, but you didn't have an icon like this. So all in all, the Fedora operating system is very pleasant to the eye. It executes very quickly as well. So moving on. This is Linux Mint with XFCE running. Linux Mint is one of my favorite distributions of Linux. It's what I run as my daily driver. Although I run Cinnamon Desktop, which is their flagship on my computer, I do run XFCE Linux Mint on my wife's computer, which is a little bit older machine. So this is a clean install. When you boot up, you'll see all these different things, and it tells you what first steps to go through to configure your system. It even makes it very easy to put in your graphic card driver, any special drivers that you need, and it will install that for you, and it goes through the documentation. I just think that Linux Mint is very clean, very easy to use. Now again, we have a bottom bar on this one, again mimicking probably Windows 10. If we push the Linux Mint button here, we get a menu that expands, and you can see by default again they install quite a few programs, including an entire Office suite, LibreOffice. You have all of your system settings and everything, and the menu is very pleasing to my eye. I guess I'm a little bit biased because this is what I like to use. Let's see if we can get some system information. Is it possible that they do not have About Me actually brings up your profile? I was hoping to pull up another About XFCE. Let me try just typing in XFCE, Terminal, Settings Manager. I guess that Linux Mint XFCE does not come with an About, but we can do just a quick little NeoFetch here that'll tell us that we are running Linux Mint 22 in this example, and that the kernel is 6.8.0. This is XFCE 4.18, the same as what Fedora was running, but behind Endeavour OS. And we can see, again, same 4 CPU computer with 8 gigabytes of RAM. So again, still a very lean system. Let's take a look at the terminal. You can see that that popped right up when I went to run NeoFetch. File folders here, if we go to the file manager, again, it's using Thunar, which is what XFCE uses by default, and we can pop through here. It's running very quickly in this environment. Let's take a look at Firefox. Again, since this is the initial execution of this environment, it's probably going to take a minute or two to pull up a web browser. But I think aesthetically that Linux Mint is very pleasant to the eye, and that it gives you a full host of tools right out of the box. Let's go ahead and execute our launch to Google. And that was fairly quick. So you can see that this is looking much more like the Endeavour OS than it did the Fedora OS. It's looking much more like a Windows, mimicking a Windows environment, where Fedora looked more like a Mac environment, but a very, very pleasant environment overall. So let's go on to the next environment. Next up is Manjaro. I personally like Manjaro, and I used it quite a while as a daily driver. It is very easy to install. It will install third-party drivers from the get-go. It does run over top of Arch Linux if you want to play with Arch a little bit, but easily installs the GUI environment of your choice, and it comes in a lot of different flavors, whether you like GNOME or whether you like KDE, or in this case XFCE. It comes in all those different flavors and is very, very easy to install. It does occasionally get a bad rap on the internet. Some people have said that there are broken links for software. I have never experienced that. I've always had really good luck with Manjaro. So let's take a look at their rendition of XFCE. When you start any Manjaro of any type, you're first going to be brought to this welcome screen, unless you turn it off here. But it does allow you to set different things here to install different applications, which is different. You can go down through here and say that I believe that this comes with Thunderbird. Here it says as default, but you just click here for Evolution and it immediately puts that on. This is an alternative to their software store. They still have a software application. To add and remove software, which looks like your typical software store that you see on any of the other versions of Linux, and that you pick what you want here. But let's take a look at the XFCE environment. Again, bottom bar, this is what we've seen now for the third time out of 4 different things that we've viewed, 4 different desktop environments. It does have a start button here that launches a very typical menu. It's kind of reversed. The programs are on the left and the menu is on the right. But you can go down and you can see that it has installed different internet applications here, and it does install a complete Office suite. Let's see if this one happens to have an About. And it does have an About XFCE present there. We can see that we have Manjaro. We're running it over Arch Linux version 4.18. This seems to be the consistent theme except for Endeavour OS. The kernel version is 1/100th behind what we saw on Fedora and Endeavour OS, 6.11. Again, 4 core, 8 gigabytes of RAM. So this is all consistent. Let's take a look at the terminal application. See how quickly that pops up. And it's very quick. They came up here, and even if we go to execute an application, it does run fairly quickly. And this is giving us all the same information we saw on the About screen. Let's take a look here at the file manager, which is still Thunar, which is what you find in XFCE in every rendition. And that did seem to come up very, very quickly. And we can run through everything here that's on this clean install. Finally, let's take a look at Firefox like we've been doing. Go to the internet and Firefox. And again, since this is the initial installation and running, it seems that Firefox does have to cache a bit here, and it'll take a minute or two to come up. Actually, it seems to be a little bit longer than what we've experienced in the other environments, and there it is. Let's go to Google like we've done in the other tests. And to my eye, even my typing there, it just seemed to be a little bit slower than what we've had on some of the other environments. But like I said, I've been a fan of Manjaro in the past, and let's see, there we go. But again, a very pleasant looking environment here, very typical Windows-like appearance with the bottom bar. Finally, we're gonna take a look at Xubuntu. Xubuntu is Ubuntu's entry into XFCE. So what I'm currently running here is the most recent version of Ubuntu with the XFCE shell. It's version 24.04. And you can see that their interpretation of XFCE puts a very small bar at the top, and this is the default installation with a couple of desktop icons here. Again, the bar is at the top, similar to what we saw in Fedora. Very small mouse icon here that if you push this, it gives you a drop-down menu. And our menu is kind of reversed like it was in the Manjaro, where you have the categories on the right and the applications on the left. Let's see if we can find an about. And there is an about XFCE. Let's take a look at that. Popped up very quickly here. You can see that we're running Ubuntu underneath with their version of Linux. The XFCE version is 4.18. The kernel is 6.8, which is what we see in all of the Ubuntu-based systems, whether it's Ubuntu, Kubuntu, Xubuntu, or Linux Mint. They're all running off the canonical repositories, which are giving you the 6.8 generic Linux at this time. Again, 4 cores, 8 gigabytes of RAM, so same system essentially. Let's take a look at how quickly the terminal may pop up here. Let's see if we type in terminal. See XFCE terminal fairly quickly. And if we try to execute a program from the terminal, NeoFetch kind of pulls up there a little bit line by line. And it does give you a little bit of information here similar to what we saw in the About box, but still fairly quickly. Let's look at the file manager and see how quickly that comes up. Also pretty quick for this virtual machine. And we can go through the different categories here. Of course, this is a blank machine, so nothing is in here. You can just see what file folders are available from the home area. Finally, we've been looking at Firefox. Let's go to Internet and see if we can pull that up. And our experience by this point is that you're going to realize that it takes a few moments on first execution for Firefox to cache and load on the very first time. So we're seeing a very similar performance here to our eye as to some of the other versions. Although at this point in time, I think that what we can determine from our personal experience was that it seemed like actually Fedora, that was pretty quick to get to Google there. It seemed to me that Fedora and Linux Mint were actually performing the fastest out of some of these environments for XFCE. So what I wanted to show was that even though these are different distributions that are all claiming to run XFCE, they don't have the same look, they don't have the same feel. Following these quick tours, let's look at some of the benchmark statistics across the different distributions as they deploy XFCE. And I'm going to be comparing the same Endeavor, Fedora, Linux Mint, Manjaro, and Xubuntu. So my virtual machine was constructed out of 8 gigabytes of RAM, a hard drive of 25 gigabytes, with 4 CPUs, and was created in VirtualBox for the purposes of testing. And as I said, the environments used were Endeavor, Fedora, Mint, Manjaro, and Xubuntu. And these were tested with Sysbench, HTOP, and NeoFetch. The first thing I looked at was which windowing system was used. Did any of these employ Wayland, which is the new and coming thing for Linux systems? It's supposed to be a more rapid windowing environment. The answer is no. All of these are on the XFCE lightweight system, and they all used X11. I looked at the kernel types, and basically all of these employed one of 3 different types of Linux and different kernel editions. They either used Arch, Fedora has its own type of Linux, or Ubuntu was used in these. So we looked at Endeavor. That was using the most current version of Linux of any of these 5 with 6.12.8. Fedora was close with 6.12.7. Manjaro had 6.11.11. Linux Mint was 6.08, and Xubuntu was 6.08, which is consistent with all of the Ubuntu Linuxes that are out there right now. All of the systems based on Ubuntu are running as of this date, 6.08. And what I did was I went into NeoFetch and I just wanted to look at the gross amount of RAM that was used. And we can see here that Fedora by far was using the most RAM. Now this has pros and cons. If you're using an older computer, you want to make sure that you have a lower amount of RAM present. But if you do have some resources present, Fedora does give you a very polished environment. But it does use a little bit more RAM. I also looked at the RAM that was reported by HTOP. These are nearly the same numbers, although Fedora, instead of being 800 something, came in at 628, the same as Manjaro, very close to Linux Mint. So they were all pretty much the same memory use as reported by HTOP. I also looked at the HTOP load, which is, HTOP looks at it in 3 different increments, 1 minute, 5 minutes, and 15 minutes. These are just the 1 minute numbers. Lower is better here. You can see that for me, Manjaro really tested better. Linux Mint here came in the slowest. This was the only time that I felt that Linux Mint failed me a little bit, and still it was not by a great number, but I was kind of surprised by that going forward. Sysbench, I looked at CPU events. This is how many times the CPU does an event in 10 seconds. A higher number is better. And I was really surprised to see that Linux Mint and Xubuntu really pulled out ahead here compared to the other versions of XFCE. I also looked at memory events in 10 seconds, pretty much on par with the exception of Endeavor, and I was really disappointed with this. I'm not quite sure what happened. I ran this a couple of times and I still kept getting low numbers for Endeavor, which is surprising because it was the lightest weight environment with the smallest amount of things installed. No Office Suite, no nothing. Very basic over Arch with a current kernel. And I expected it to perform very well, and it did not. And you will see that the others were all in the 50 million range and fairly competitive with each other. I also looked at Sysbench CPU latency. This is in milliseconds, lower is better. Take a look at Linux Mint there. It really came out racing, showing very low latency. Sysbench memory latency. Again, Endeavor, I expected to perform very well with the parts that it has installed, and it did not. It actually had the highest latency. We're looking for lower is better here. The other 4 were fairly competitive in the same ballpark range, although Manjaro did pull it out, and Xubuntu was actually the fastest. My conclusions after all this were, I was really surprised that Endeavor, which I wanted to perform really well and wanted it as a hope for using it on older machines since it was a very lightweight install, it did use the least amount of RAM, and this may be helpful on older machines. Endeavor and Fedora also used the cutting edges of Linux kernel. Fedora was very polished and a high performer, but overall I felt that Linux Mint outperformed everybody with the exception of the HTOP load. It is easy to install. It is easy to install your graphic drivers. It is easy to use because it's based on the Debian structure and in Ubuntu. I just felt that it came out ahead even with that very high evaluation of HTOP load. And I felt if you combine the performance of Linux Mint and the ease of use, that it probably came out as what I would select to use XFCE. Your mileage may vary. Manjaro's did seem to have similar performance, and if you really wanted to play with Arch Linux, Manjaro is based on Arch, and it may be a viable option to install Manjaro. That also installs third-party graphic drivers with ease from the get-go, and allows you to play with Arch Linux, which a lot of people right now want to play with Arch Linux running underneath the system. Other people who have evaluated Manjaro have complained about broken links and so forth. I did not find any of that or have a problem with any of that. But still, my conclusion was that Linux Mint gave you the best performance and the most bang for your buck in an XFCE.
Well, I think the biggest thing that we can take away from this is that despite the fact that all of these environments were running XFCE, performance was different, aesthetics were different, and just general use was slightly different between all the different desktop distributions. So you pick the one that you like. I'm very biased. I think that, as I had said earlier, that my choice would probably be the Linux Mint, and that what I have used on my wife's computer to give her a lighter weight environment. But I think that it's personal preference. I was really surprised by the performance of Endeavour OS. But if you found any of this information helpful, please give me a thumbs up. And if you really found it helpful, you can hit the subscribe button. And thanks for stopping by here at Bites Bread and Barbecue. See you later. Bye.